The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight when the ambulance doors slammed open, and everything inside Mercy General's emergency room shifted from urgent to critical. A young woman, barely 23, arrived with vitals that made no sense and symptoms that pointed in 12 different directions at once. 22 doctors rotated through her case over the next 4 hours, each one adding another theory, another test, another reason to wait. And somewhere in the back hallway, a black maintenance technician named Darius Mitchell stood with a mop in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear, listening to his 7-year-old daughter ask when he was coming home. He didn't know yet that the answer would depend on whether anyone in that building had the courage to make a decision. The emergency room at Mercy General operated like a machine that night, precise and relentless, each component moving in practiced synchronization. Nurses checked monitors every 90 seconds. Residents shuffled between beds with clipboards pressed against their chests. Attending physicians huddled near the central station, their voices low and measured, discussing differential diagnosis with the detached calm of professionals who had seen everything. But beneath that calm, something else was building. The young woman in Bay 7 wasn't responding to any of the standard interventions, and her vitals kept sliding in directions that defied explanation. Dr. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the huddle, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She had been an emergency physician for 8 years, long enough to recognize the particular tension that filled a room when certainty began to slip away. The patient's name was Sarah Hollister. She had been brought in by her roommate after collapsing in their apartment, and in the 4 hours since her arrival, she had become the subject of intense debate among every specialist Mercy General could summon. Cardiology suspected an arrhythmia. Neurology wanted to rule out a stroke. Internal medicine was pushing for sepsis protocols. And somewhere in the chaos of competing opinions, the actual treatment had stalled. Emily watched the monitors from across the room. Sarah's blood pressure was holding, but just barely. Her oxygen saturation kept dipping into concerning territory before climbing back up, as if her body couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. The pattern bothered Emily in a way she couldn't articulate, a persistent itch at the back of her mind that told her something fundamental was being missed. Dr. Richard Vance, the senior attending, called for another round of blood work. It was his third order in 2 hours, and Emily could see the fatigue in his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing down on shoulders that had carried it for 30 years. Vance was a careful man, methodical to a fault, and tonight that caution had calcified into paralysis. Every suggestion was met with a request for more data. Every proposed intervention was deferred pending additional consultation. The machine kept running, but it had stopped moving forward. In the maintenance corridor behind the ER, Darius Mitchell pushed his cart through the fluorescent gloom and tried to focus on the task at hand. His deep brown hands tightened around the mop handle as he moved. The floor near Bay 3 needed attention, some kind of spill that had been called in 20 minutes ago, and he was already behind schedule. His shift had started at 11, and it was now past 3 in the morning. That dead hour when hospitals became strange, and hollow places filled with the ghosts of everyone who had ever waited for news that might never come. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was. "Daddy!" Amara's voice was small and sleepy, muffled by what he imagined was her favorite blanket, pulled up to her chin. "Are you coming home soon?" Darius leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Mrs. Patterson from next door was staying with Amara, had been since Darius's shift started, and he knew the older woman didn't mind. But Amara had been waking up in the middle of the night more often lately, her small brown fingers reaching for a presence that was increasingly absent, and the guilt of it sat heavy in Darius's chest. "Soon, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice soft. "Go back to sleep, okay? I'll be there when you wake up. Promise, promise." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, letting the silence of the corridor settle around him. Through the wall, he could hear the muffled chaos of the ER, voices rising and falling in urgent conference, the beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. It was a familiar symphony, one he had known intimately in another life, and the memory of it pulled at something deep inside him. He'd been an EMT once, a good one by most accounts, the kind who could read a scene in seconds, who could make decisions under pressure that others spent hours debating. But that was before the funeral, before the small hand that now reached for him in the darkness, needing something he wasn't sure he knew how to give. Darius pushed off the wall and kept walking. The spill in Bay 3 wasn't going to clean itself, and he had learned a long time ago that keeping busy was the only way to silence the voices in his head. Darius found the spill near Bay 3, a knocked-over cup of coffee that had spread across the linoleum in a dark, irregular stain. He positioned his mop and began working the liquid toward the drain, his movements automatic, his mind elsewhere. The ER's controlled chaos continued around him, nurses brushing past without acknowledgement, doctors conferring in hushed tones near the central station. As a black man in this space, he was used to being invisible here, just another piece of the hospital's machinery, and most days that suited him fine. But tonight, something kept pulling his attention toward Bay 7. He could see the curtain from where he stood, could hear fragments of the ongoing discussion drifting through the noise. A resident was advocating for an aggressive intervention. Someone else was pushing back, citing liability concerns. The words blurred together, medical terminology mixed with bureaucratic caution. But one phrase cut through clearly. "We need to be certain before we act." Certain. Darius almost laughed. In his years as an EMT, certainty had been a luxury he rarely possessed. You worked with what you had. You made the best call you could. And sometimes when everything pointed in one direction but your gut screamed something else entirely, you learned to trust the thing that couldn't be measured. He finished with the spill and pushed his cart towards the supply closet, pausing near the edge of Bay 7's curtain. Through the gap, he could see the patient, a young woman with dark hair spread across the pillow, her face pale and sheened with sweat. The monitors beside her bed painted a picture in numbers and waveforms, a picture that Darius found himself reading without conscious thought. And then he heard it. One of the nurses was reciting the patient's history to a newly arrived consultant, running through the timeline of symptoms with practiced efficiency. Collapse at home, confusion upon arrival, intermittent chest pain, shortness of breath, and something else, something mentioned almost as an afterthought. The patient had complained of a metallic taste in her mouth before losing consciousness. Darius's hand tightened on his mop. Metallic taste, he knew that symptom. He had seen it exactly twice in his career, both times in situations that had required immediate, specific intervention. It was a small detail easily overlooked in the avalanche of data that accompanied any critical case. But it changed everything. He stood frozen for a moment, caught between the life he had left behind and the one he had built in its place. The maintenance technician in him said to keep walking, to finish his shift and go home to his daughter. But the EMT, the version of himself that still lived somewhere beneath the uniform and the grief, that part of him wouldn't let go. His phone buzzed again. "Amara, Daddy, I had a bad dream." Darius pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes still fixed on the gap in the curtain. "I'm here, sweetheart. There was a monster. It was hiding in the closet, and it kept getting closer. Monsters aren't real, Amara. You know that." But it felt real. He could hear the tremor in her voice, the genuine fear that no amount of rational explanation could fully dispel. She was 7 years old, and the world was still full of shadows that might or might not contain something terrible. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monster. It's not knowing what to do about it. But you're brave, Amara. You're the bravest person I know, and brave people don't let fear make their decisions for them." He heard her sniffle, then a small, steadying breath. "Okay, Daddy, go back to sleep. I love you. Love you too." He ended the call and stood there, his own words echoing in his head. Brave people don't let fear make their decisions for them. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent the last 2 years making exactly that kind of decision, choosing safety over risk, invisibility over engagement. He had told himself it was for Amara's sake, that she needed stability more than she needed a father who chased emergencies. But standing here now, listening to 22 doctors argue about a patient who was running out of time, he wondered if the real monster had been hiding in his own closet all along. Darius pushed his cart to the side and walked toward the nurse's station. Dr. Emily Carter was there reviewing something on a tablet, her expression a careful mask of professional composure. He approached slowly, aware of how this would look, aware of the lines he was about to cross. Dr. Carter? She looked up, her eyes registering surprise at being addressed by someone whose name badge clearly marked him as maintenance staff. Can I help you? The patient in Bay 7? The one everyone's been arguing about? Darius kept his voice low, conscious of the ears around them. Someone mentioned she had a metallic taste before she collapsed. Has anyone followed up on that? Emily's expression shifted, curiosity replacing surprise. Why do you ask? Because I've seen that symptom before, twice. Both times it was a sign of something specific, something that wouldn't show up on standard panels. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I used to be an EMT. I know I'm not part of the medical team here, but if no one else has considered it, maybe it's worth checking. For a long moment, Emily simply looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. Then she glanced down at the tablet in her hands, at the cascade of test results and specialist opinions that had accumulated over the past 4 hours. What exactly do you think we're missing? She asked. Before Darius could answer, a voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Dr. Carter. It was Dr. Vance, the senior attending, his tone carrying the particular edge of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought. Is there a reason you're consulting with the janitorial staff about patient care? Emily straightened, her professional mask sliding firmly back into place. Mr. Mitchell was just making an observation about the patient's history. He has some medical background. Vance's gaze shifted to Darius, appraising him with the kind of dismissiveness that came naturally to men who had spent decades at the top of hierarchies. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Mitchell, but I think we have the situation under control. If you could focus on your actual responsibilities, we'd all be grateful. Darius felt the words like a physical weight pressing him back toward the margins where he belonged. The old instincts were still there, the urge to defer to authority, to accept his place in the order of things. But so was the image of Amara reaching for him in the dark and the young woman in Bay 7 whose monitors were telling a story that no one seemed willing to read. With respect, Dr. Vance, Darius said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. I'm not sure you do. The metallic taste, she reported, combined with her cardiac irregularities, it could indicate heavy metal toxicity, specifically thallium. It wouldn't show up on your standard tox screen, and if that's what's happening, she'll be dead by morning. The words hung in the air, sharp and unwelcome. Vance's expression hardened around them. The ER continued its endless choreography, but Darius could feel the attention of nearby staff shifting toward the confrontation. Mr. Mitchell, Vance said slowly, you're not a doctor. You're not even a nurse. You have no standing to make a diagnosis. And frankly, your presence in this conversation is inappropriate. I suggest you return to your duties before I'm forced to escalate this to hospital administration. Darius's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look to know it was Amara again, probably awake and wondering why he hadn't called back. The pull of it was almost physical, a rope tethering him to the life he had chosen. The safe and simple life where the hardest decisions involved bedtimes and breakfast menus. But the young woman in Bay 7 didn't have anyone to call. She was alone in that bed, surrounded by experts who were too afraid of being wrong to risk being right. Dr. Vance, Darius said quietly, I understand why you're hesitant. Thallium poisoning is rare. It's not the obvious answer, but sometimes the obvious answers are wrong, and waiting for certainty means waiting until it's too late. He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that someone outside your system might see something you can't. That's all. Vance opened his mouth to respond, But before he could speak, one of the monitors in Bay 7 emitted a sharp, insistent alarm. Everyone turned toward the sound, toward the curtain that separated Sarah Hollister from the rest of the world. Her vitals were dropping again, and this time they weren't climbing back up. Emily Carter moved first. She crossed the distance to Bay 7 in seconds, pulling back the curtain to reveal Sarah Hollister's deteriorating form. The young woman's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing had become shallow and labored. The cardiac monitor showed an erratic rhythm, spikes and valleys that painted a picture of a heart struggling to maintain its essential function. "She's decompensating," Emily said, her voice carrying the particular calm that came from years of training. "Get me a crash cart and page the on-call cardiologist." The ER snapped into action around her, nurses and residents converging on the bed with practiced efficiency. But even as she worked to stabilize the patient, Emily's mind kept returning to what Darius had said. Thallium poisoning. It was rare, almost exotic, the kind of diagnosis you read about in medical journals, but rarely encountered in practice. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. The metallic taste, the cardiac irregularities, the confusion and weakness that had defied every other explanation. Thallium was a heavy metal that accumulated slowly, poisoning the body's systems one by one until they began to fail in cascade. It wouldn't appear on standard toxicology panels because no one thought to look for it. And by the time the symptoms became unmistakable, it was often too late. Emily grabbed her tablet and began scrolling through Sarah's chart, searching for something, anything that might confirm or deny the hypothesis. Family history, unremarkable. Recent travel? None. Occupational exposure? She worked at a small manufacturing company. Quality control. The details snagged in Emily's mind like a thread catching on rough wood. Manufacturing quality control. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread worth pulling. "Someone get me a thallium panel," she said, not looking up from the tablet. "And I need a detailed history on her workplace. Find out what chemicals she might have been exposed to." Dr. Vance appeared at her shoulder, his expression thunderous. "Dr. Carter, what exactly do you think you're doing? We have protocols for a reason. You can't just order obscure tests based on the speculation of a janitor." "He's not a janitor," Emily said, still focused on the chart. "He's a former EMT, and right now, his speculation is the only thing that explains what's happening to this patient. That's not your call to make." Emily finally looked up, meeting Vance's gaze with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. "With all due respect, Dr. Vance, someone has to make a call. We've been running in circles for 4 hours while she gets worse. If there's even a chance that Mr. Mitchell is right, we owe it to her to find out." Vance's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, one of the nurses interrupted. "Dr. Carter, the patient's BP is dropping, 80 over 50 and falling." Emily turned back to the bed, pushing the argument aside. There would be time for professional consequences later. Right now, there was only Sarah Hollister and the numbers that kept sliding in the wrong direction. Outside the curtain, Darius stood with his back against the wall, his mop abandoned beside him. He could hear everything that was happening in Bay 7, could track the rising tension in the voices and the increasingly urgent rhythm of the monitors. Part of him wanted to leave, to retreat to the safety of corridors and supply closets, where his opinion didn't matter and his presence went unnoticed. But a larger part, the part that had spent years running toward emergencies instead of away from them, kept him rooted in place. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket and saw Amara's face on the screen, a photo he had taken last summer at the County Fair. Her smile wide and gap-toothed, her skin glowing in the sunlight, utterly untroubled. He answered without thinking. "Hey, sweetheart, Daddy, are you okay? You sound weird." He almost laughed. 7 years old, and she could read his mood through a phone line. "I'm fine, Amara, just busy. Is Mrs. Patterson with you? She's sleeping in the chair. She snores really loud. That's because she's tired. Be nice." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the particular quality of silence that meant Amara was thinking something through. "Daddy, are you helping someone?" The question caught him off guard. "What makes you ask that?" because you always sound like that when you're helping someone. Like you're worried, but also, I don't know, like you're doing something important. Darius closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle around him like a familiar coat. She remembered. Of course she remembered. She had been 5 when he left the EMT service, old enough to absorb the shape of his days, even if she couldn't understand their content. She knew what it sounded like when her father was fighting to save a life. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm trying to help someone. Good. That's what you're supposed to do." The simplicity of it nearly broke him. In Amara's world, the moral calculus was straightforward. You helped people because that was what you did. Because turning away was unthinkable. She hadn't yet learned about liability and protocols, about the 1,000 small fears that accumulated over a lifetime until they formed walls too high to climb. "I love you, Amara." "Love you too, Daddy. Don't forget to come home." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, letting her words echo in the hollow space behind his ribs. Then he pushed off the wall and walked back toward Bay 7. The results came back 23 minutes later. Thallium levels in Sarah Hollister's blood were nearly 4 times the acceptable limit. Somewhere in the quality control lab where she worked, someone had been slowly poisoning her, and the accumulated toxin had finally reached the point where her body could no longer compensate. Emily stared at the numbers on her screen, feeling something shift inside her, a tectonic adjustment in the landscape of her assumptions. Darius Mitchell had been right. The black maintenance technician with no standing and no credentials had seen something that 22 doctors had missed. "Start chelation therapy immediately," she said, her voice carrying across the bay, "and get me the on-call toxicologist. We need to move fast." Dr. Vance appeared beside her again, but this time his expression was different. The anger replaced by something more complicated. "The thallium panel," he said slowly. "You ordered it based on his suggestion. I ordered it because it was the right thing to do." Emily met his gaze steadily, and because sometimes the answer comes from the last place you expect. Around them, the ER continued its endless work, lives saved and lost in the space between heartbeats. But in Bay 7, something was changing. The intervention Darius had suggested was being implemented, the specific treatment that might pull Sarah Hollister back from the edge. The question now was whether they had moved fast enough. Darius stood at the edge of the ER, watching the controlled chaos unfold from a distance. He had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands, in the domain of doctors and nurses, and the mysterious calculus of medicine that he had once understood but no longer claimed. His phone sat heavy in his pocket, silent now. Amara was probably asleep again, dreaming of monsters that weren't real and fathers who always came home. He wanted to be there with her, to sit beside her bed and watch her breathe, to pretend that the world was as simple and safe as her 7-year-old imagination believed. But he also wanted to see this through. Whatever happened to Sarah Hollister, he needed to know. Emily found him there an hour later, still waiting, still watching. The chelation therapy was underway, and Sarah's vitals had stabilized, though she remained unconscious. The road ahead would be long, involving extensive treatment and probably a criminal investigation into whoever had been adding thallium to her environment. But she was alive. Against all odds and expectations, she was still alive. "You were right," Emily said, stopping beside him. "I don't know how you knew, but you were right." Darius shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I got lucky. The metallic taste triggered a memory. That's all. That's not luck. That's experience." She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes curious. "You said you used to be an EMT. What happened?" The question hung between them, weighted with everything he didn't want to say. Darius looked away toward the windows where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the rain. "Life happened," he said finally, "the kind that doesn't leave room for anything else." Emily nodded slowly, as if she understood more than his words had actually conveyed. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you were here tonight, and I'm sorry about how Dr. Vance treated you." That wasn't right. He was doing his job, protecting the system. Darius's voice carried no bitterness, only the flat acceptance of someone who had learned to expect nothing different. I'm not part of that system anymore. I made my choice. Did you? Emily tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you never really left. Before Darius could respond, her pager went off, pulling her attention back to the endless demands of the ER. She gave him a brief nod and turned away, disappearing into the organized chaos that was her natural habitat. Darius stood there for a moment longer, her words echoing in his mind. Then he picked up his mop and returned to work. The 6 minutes that followed the administration of chelation therapy were the longest of Darius's life. He had returned to his duties, pushing his cart through the corridors with mechanical precision, but his attention remained fixed on Bay 7. Every alarm, every raised voice, every change in the ambient rhythm of the ER sent a spike of adrenaline through his system. He had done everything he could. The rest was beyond his control, but knowing that didn't make the waiting any easier. The ER had settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that preceded either relief or disaster. Staff moved between beds with subdued efficiency, their voices low, their movements careful. The rain continued to fall outside, a steady percussion against the windows that seemed to mark the passage of time in a way that clocks could not. Darius found himself near the supply closet again, close enough to Bay 7 to hear the monitors, but far enough to maintain the pretense of invisibility. His phone remained silent in his pocket. Amara was sleeping. Mrs. Patterson was snoring, and somewhere in the distance a life hung in the balance. He thought about his wife, Tiana. She had been a nurse at this very hospital back when Darius was still running toward emergencies instead of away from them. They had met in an ER, not unlike this one, during a mass casualty event that had pushed everyone past their limits. She had been calm in the chaos, a steady presence amid the screaming and the blood, her warm brown skin a comfort to everyone she touched, and he had fallen in love with her before the night was over. They had married quickly, too quickly according to some, but neither of them had seen the point in waiting. Life was short and uncertain, and they had both seen too many people run out of time to waste any of their own. Amara had come along 2 years later, a small miracle with Tiana's eyes and Darius's stubborn streak. There were framed photos of their beautiful black family on the wall of their home, captured moments of a joy that felt untouchable. And for a while, everything had been exactly as it should be. Then Tiana had gotten sick, the kind of sick that didn't get better, that only got worse until there was nothing left to lose. Darius had taken care of her through every stage, balancing shifts at the EMT station with nights at her bedside, watching the woman he loved fade into someone he barely recognized. She had died on a Tuesday. He remembered that with painful clarity. Tuesdays had been their date nights back before the illness, back when they still believed in futures. After the funeral, he had looked at Amara's small, bewildered face and made a decision. He would step back from the work that kept pulling him away. He would be present for his daughter in a way he hadn't been able to be present for his wife. He would choose safety over risks, stability over chaos, even if it meant becoming invisible. That had been 2 years ago, and until tonight he had convinced himself it was the right choice. The monitors in Bay 7 chirped, a different sound this time, less urgent, almost hopeful. Darius's breath caught in his throat. Around him the ER seemed to hold its breath as well, everyone listening, everyone waiting. Then Emily's voice, clear and relieved. Vitals are stabilizing. She's responding to treatment. The words washed over Darius like warm water, loosening something that had been clenched tight in his chest for hours. Sarah Hollister was going to live. The intervention had worked. His instinct, the one he had tried so hard to bury, had been right. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, feeling the tension drain from his body. This was why he had become an EMT in the first place. Not for the adrenaline or the heroics, but for this, the moment when death stepped back and life pushed forward. The moment when everything you had done, every risk you had taken, proved itself worthwhile. His phone buzzed. Amara again. "Daddy?" Her voice was groggy, still half asleep. "I heard a noise." "What kind of noise, sweetheart?" "I don't know. Like a happy noise. Does that make sense?" Darius smiled despite everything. "Yeah, Amara, that makes sense. Are you coming home now?" He looked towards Base 7, toward the curtain that hid Sarah Hollister from view. The crisis had passed. The doctors would take it from here, managing the treatment and the recovery and all the things that came after. His part was done. "Yeah," he said, "I'm coming home." The dawn light was beginning to filter through the ER windows when Emily found Darius again. He was gathering his supplies, preparing to clock out after a shift that had lasted far longer than scheduled. His movements were slow, weighted with exhaustion, but there was something different in his posture, a looseness that hadn't been there before. "She's awake," Emily said, stopping a few feet away. "Sarah, she's asking about the people who saved her." Darius paused, his hand on the cart. "That's good. She should know. I told her about you, about how you caught what everyone else missed." Emily's voice was quiet, almost tentative. "She wants to meet you when she's stronger, to say thank you." Darius shook his head slowly. "She doesn't need to thank me. I just pointed in a direction. You're the ones who did the actual work. That's not how she sees it. And honestly, it's not how I see it either." Emily moved closer, her expression serious. "What you did tonight, Darius, it mattered. You could have stayed invisible. You could have kept your head down and let us figure it out on our own, but you didn't. You spoke up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I almost didn't. The admission came out before he could stop it. Part of me wanted to walk away, the part that's been in charge for the past 2 years. What stopped you?" Darius thought about Amara's voice on the phone, about monsters in closets and brave people who didn't let fear make their decisions. "My daughter," he said finally. "She reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Emily nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I looked you up, your EMT record. You were good, really good. 3 commendations for exceptional service. A reputation for staying calm under pressure." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "The system lost something when you left. The system didn't lose anything. I just stopped being part of it." Darius's voice carried no self-pity, only the flat acknowledgement of a choice made and lived with. "Amara needed me more than the job did. That's not complicated. It doesn't have to be one or the other." Emily's gaze was steady, unwavering. "There are ways to use what you know without sacrificing what you have. You proved that tonight." Before Darius could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Dr. Carter, Mr. Mitchell." It was the hospital administrator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he had been awoken from a deep sleep to deal with exactly this kind of situation. "I understand there was an incident tonight involving unauthorized medical advice." Emily stiffened. "Mr. Mitchell identified a critical detail that our team had overlooked. His input directly contributed to saving a patient's life. That may be true, but it also represents a significant deviation from hospital protocol." The administrator's tone was measured, neither hostile nor friendly. "Mitchell, I'll need you to come to my office for a formal interview. We need to understand exactly what happened and whether any policies were violated." Darius felt the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. Of course there would be consequences. Of course the system would reassert itself, demanding explanations and justifications for actions taken in the heat of crisis. He had known this would happen from the moment he opened his mouth. I'll be there," he said quietly, "but first I need to make a phone call. My daughter is waiting for me." The administrator hesitated, then nodded. 1 hour. My office. As he walked away, Emily turned to Darius with an expression that mixed frustration with something like admiration. "I'll go with you. Someone needs to explain the medical side of what happened. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to. What you did tonight took courage. The least I can do is stand next to you while they question it." Darius studied her for a moment. This woman who had listened when others hadn't, who had acted when action carried risk. "Thank you," he said finally. "That means more than you know." He pulled out his phone and dialed home. Amara answered on the second ring, her voice bright and fully awake now, filled with the boundless energy of a child who had survived another night of imaginary monsters. "Daddy, are you coming home? Mrs. Patterson is making pancakes." "I'm coming, sweetheart. But I have one more thing to do first. It might take a little while. That's okay. I'll save you some pancakes. You do that." He smiled, feeling the warmth of her voice cutting through the exhaustion and the uncertainty. "I love you, Amara. Love you too, Daddy. Hurry home." The interview lasted longer than Darius expected. The administrator, whose name was Mr. Whitfield, asked detailed questions about Darius's actions throughout the night, documenting everything in precise bureaucratic language. Emily sat beside him, providing medical context and defending his intervention at every turn. By the time they emerged, the morning shift had already begun, and the ER was humming with a new set of emergencies. Dr. Vance was waiting in the hallway. His expression had shifted since the night before, the dismissiveness replaced by something more complex. Perhaps respect, perhaps discomfort at having been wrong. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to dismiss your observation, and I was wrong about how I treated you. If you hadn't spoken up, Miss Hollister might not have survived the night." Darius nodded slowly, accepting the words without celebration. "You were doing what you thought was right, protecting the patient, protecting the team. I understand that. That doesn't excuse it." Vance extended his hand, a gesture that clearly cost him something. "Thank you for not giving up when I told you to." Darius shook the offered hand, feeling a strange sense of closure. "It's what I was trained to do, even if I don't do it anymore." Vance released his grip and walked away, leaving Darius standing in the corridor with Emily. The morning light streamed through the windows now, bright and warming, chasing away the shadows of the night. "So, what happens now?" Darius asked, glancing toward the administrator's office. "Am I fired?" Emily shook her head. "No, Mr. Whitfield is recommending a commendation. He says your actions exemplify the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration the hospital wants to encourage." She allowed herself a small smile. "I think he's mostly just relieved that we didn't lose a patient on his watch." Darius absorbed this, feeling something he hadn't expected. Hope. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but it was there nonetheless. "I should go home," he said. "My daughter is waiting." "Darius." Emily stopped him with a hand on his arm. "What I said before about there being ways to use what you know without sacrificing what you have, I meant it. We have an EMT liaison position opening up next month. Training and consultation work, regular hours, no emergency calls." She paused, letting the implications settle. "It's not the same as what you used to do, but it might be a way back." Darius looked at her for a long moment, weighing the offer against the life he had built. Amara's face floated in his mind, gap-toothed and trusting. She needed him. She would always need him, but maybe needing him didn't mean losing him to a job that consumed everything. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I can promise." Emily nodded, accepting this. "Take your time. The position isn't going anywhere." Darius walked out of Mercy General as the morning sun broke fully over the city. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, and the air smelled clean and new, washed of everything that had come before. His car was waiting in the parking lot, the same battered sedan that had carried him through countless shifts and emergencies, and he climbed inside with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for far too long. The drive home took 20 minutes. He used the time to let his mind empty, to release the tension that had accumulated over the past 12 hours. The city scrolled past outside his window, a landscape of ordinary people doing ordinary things, unaware of the small dramas that played out every night in the rooms they passed. Amara was waiting on the porch when he pulled into the driveway. She launched herself at him the moment he opened the car door, her small brown arms wrapping around his waist with a strength that always surprised him. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I always come back." He knelt down to meet her eyes, brushing a strand of tight curls from her face. "That's what daddies do. Did you help the person, the one you were worried about? Darius thought about Sarah Hollister, awake now, and asking about the people who had saved her. He thought about Emily's offer, about the possibility of a future that included both presence and purpose. He thought about Tiana and how proud she would be of the daughter she had left behind. "Yeah," he said softly, "I helped her." Amara's face broke into a smile, the same smile that reminded him every day why he had made the choices he made. "Good. Now come inside. Mrs. Patterson really did save you pancakes." Darius laughed, the first genuine laugh he had managed in what felt like days. He stood up, took his daughter's hand, and walked toward the house where his real life waited. Behind him, the sun continued to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the city, Sarah Hollister was beginning her recovery, and 22 doctors were learning a lesson they would never forget. And in a small house on an ordinary street, a black father and daughter sat down to breakfast together. The shadows of the night finally vanished by morning. Darius didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would accept Emily's offer or if he would remain invisible, content with the safe and simple life he had chosen. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight he had remembered who he was, and some rememberings, once they happened, couldn't be undone. The pancakes were cold by the time they started eating, but neither of them cared. They talked about ordinary things, about school and weather and the neighbor's new puppy. And when Amara looked up at him with Tiana's eyes and asked if he would be home for dinner, Darius smiled and said yes. Not because it was the safe answer, but because it was true. Outside, the world kept spinning. Emergencies kept happening. People kept needing help. And Darius Mitchell, former EMT and current father, began to imagine a life where those truths didn't have to be in conflict. It would take time. It would take courage. But for the first time in 2 years, he believed it was possible. And that was enough for now.